without any more ado, I'd like you to introduce to a long-term supporter of Shar-E-Fest. Kristina has done a wonderful job in submissions every year and has helped us a tremendous amount. She's a very expert practitioner, and I have to say she's just been invited as a keynote in Europe, which I think is great for her and for the people in Europe, actually. So I now hand you over to Kristina. SmartEvidence, enhancing ePortfolios with evidence maps. Thanks, Kristina.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's nice being back in Hamilton for Shar-E-Fest because it's always great to see the practices that have been developed over the past year that have continued from previous years already. Today I'm going to, as Richard said, talk a little bit about SmartEvidence. It's something that we started development work on for Mahara, the ePortfolio system that a number of you are using. It's not finished work, so it's really work in progress. But I do want to talk about it because I want to see what you think about it. So not just presenting you something that is done and tried and all that, but kind of start engaging with you in conversations about it in order to make it better, to get it further along the line, and also see, is it actually something that you'd be interested of doing? And I'm asking these questions because I'm the Mahara project lead. I work at Catalyst, and so we are quite responsible for the development of Mahara and kind of what gets put into the core product. We do a lot of development work for our clients and also bring out 2 versions of Mahara each year. And so, of course, we always want to put something into the software that is of interest to everyone who uses it. And over the past years, we've seen that assessment has been becoming more and more important in ePortfolio development. Mahara, as a small historical abstract, started development actually here in New Zealand by a bunch of universities, and it was started as personal learning environment. So it's a really where you work with others, where you can collaborate, where you showcase your professional development, where you collect and collate all your evidence. However, over the years, it's also been used in many other different organizations. It's been used outside of New Zealand in schools, universities for accreditation purposes, and so on. And so, of course, also over time, the focus of ePortfolios has been expanded or has shifted. So it's not just that a personal learning environment is important, but now if we look at nursing organizations or even teacher registration, there's usually some sort of accreditation or assessment component involved. And that, of course, means that people who like using Mahara or even love it, there are people known to do that, they also want to be able to incorporate their assessments and also accreditation bits and pieces in there and use it for those purposes and not switch to a different software. And so that's where we've come in particular with the University of Canberra, who started this entire project last year, thinking about it, how can we actually bring more assessment components to an ePortfolio? And in this case, it really is Mahara, but kind of not necessarily, if you don't use it, you don't really need to know any, or need to have any prior knowledge in it. It is more kind of thinking about, would that be something useful for you as well? So the status quo for our ePortfolio at the moment is if you have teacher registration criteria or nurse registration criteria, you set up everything in your portfolio that can be as part of a template so that not every nurse needs to set things up herself or every teacher needs to write down the criteria, put them into the portfolio, and then fill in the content. So you can already do all that. But what really is missing is a visual overview of where you are at. So, and that's where evidence maps come in. They are nothing really new. So you might have already seen them. This one here is one from the ACT over in Australia, and it pretty much shows the evidence on the left and then the substandards on the top. And as you can see, it's not really easy to see. And it's just a really big table with a bunch of numbers in it, very tiny font, and then a check mark where the teacher has provided some evidence. And that's it. But in order to actually see the evidence, you need to go somewhere else, find substandard, find the evidence, and read up on it. And so what we would really want to do is kind of merge the map together with the evidence so that all these things can be accessed in one place. And so the idea really is this. Again, it is still a big table, but kind of your screen is a little bit limited in some ways, so we only show part of it. And in the next few slides, I'm going to unpack this table a little bit more so that we can actually see and look at the individual components. So at the top, we have the standards and the substandards, because oftentimes accreditation frameworks have at least 5 to 7 standards that are then subdivided into other parts, and the learner or the person needing to or being up for accreditation or recertification needs to kind of show that they are competent in all those areas. But instead of just providing them with the numbers of the substandards, the online environment makes it possible for us to actually also show them what the substandard actually is, so that nobody needs to pull out their little booklet and kind of read up on it again. Now, what sort of evidence do I need for this standard? But everything is really at their fingertips. So with a mouse over effect or even point and click when you're on a mobile device, you'd be able to see what the requirements are for a certain standard or substandard. And then, of course, you can add your evidence. So in Mahara, this would be pages, because it would still fit into our framework there of having evidence within pages. And so you would create one page that does not necessarily just need to contain one piece of evidence, but it can contain all the evidences related to that piece what you're working on. So if your evidence is a lesson plan, then you would put in your lesson plan, but also any supporting handouts or images that you're using in the class. And what would be possible is that a certain number of evidence pages is already set up for you automatically, because oftentimes we know that at least 10 different pieces of evidence are required in order to make it to the next stage and in order to kind of fulfill the standards. And so that would be there, but you would still be able to add more. And of course, a big piece now is the assessment itself. And so once you add evidence, you would, as user, of course, would need to say to which substandard that evidence belongs. So then it becomes a round circle in the mock-up at the moment. So colors and all that can still change. But it's just an indicator that you have some evidence there. But it's not just like a multiple choice test where you just color in the circle and you're done with it. But you'd also need to think about, why am I putting that against this substandard? So there's an annotation request required for it. And then if you have an assessor who looks at your work, they can then say, yes, I agree with that reflection or with what has been said in that annotation, and I assert that this evidence meets the requirements, so it would get a green check mark. Or if there's still a little bit more work necessary, then it would just be an orange circle. But at least in the map, the student or learner as well as the assessor would immediately see where there is already evidence, which evidence has already been assessed, and which evidence has already been kind of marked as complete and where they don't need anything anymore. And Heath?
Kristina, looks cool. Is there a way of assigning as the tutor, say through the submission option, that a particular bit of evidence is part of an assignment? So when you set up the assignment in, say, Moodle, that it tells the student that evidence is required for that submission?
So just for Otago, the question was that when you connect Moodle and Mahara together and you give one assignment, can you say directly to which part of the standards the evidence belongs to? That is a possibility. We haven't thought about that yet, but connecting Moodle and Mahara together for that purpose and making the assignment part of the evidence map is definitely a possibility. One easy way of doing it would be go to your SmartEvidence collection, and you would need to fill in, or you'd need to look at these 2 standards and gather evidence for that. So on a more manual way. But I can think of possibilities also of automating that a bit so that it's, again, easier for the students to actually find directly where they need to go. So this entire evidence map itself is either the beginning or the end of a collection. So it would sit within a collection of Mahara pages and form one portfolio. And beginning and end, so that in the beginning it's oftentimes good, especially if you tie it to classwork, that you see immediately where you're at. But some people we've learned from TQI, the Teacher Quality Institute in Australia, and the ACT, is also that they didn't want to put it at the beginning, because that could just mean that it becomes a check mark and checklist portfolio, that the teachers could look at, okay, I don't have evidence here, okay, now I need one evidence for this substandard, but not really look more holistically and look at their evidence across all standards. So it's definitely a possibility here to include that. And so by having the map and having it visualized where you still need evidence, yes, it could be looked at as a checklist, but oftentimes we do want to know quite quickly where do we stand, what do we still have to do in order to meet the minimum criteria, or also, actually this evidence here meets 2 standards. That's really good. Maybe there's also other things where I can connect things together so that it's not just always one evidence, one substandard, next evidence, next substandard, but where you really see how your teaching or how your learning actually affects many different learning areas, and also you gain competencies in many different areas and not just in one. And by just having the portfolio there and looking at it in individual pages doesn't really help so much, whereas a visualization in form of an evidence map can really facilitate that, we think. But then, of course, at the end, because we do oftentimes need it for assessment purposes, you get a tally up where you can see how many pieces of evidence you actually have for a certain standard or substandard, and where you're still missing things. So that is really for those that towards the end of the semester still need to get cracking a little bit and need to get put some more work in. And if you have a smaller screen, there's also there would also be a summary section. So again, you can see quite quickly where you have evidence already collected and where there's still something missing. Because as we've seen, it is very hard to get, or very difficult to get, one big table, sometimes containing of 27 elements, onto a computer screen without getting completely intelligible. And therefore we try to chunk the map up a little bit, but then still provide a summary to put everything on the screen. So what we are not doing is that we are looking at, thanks. What we are not doing is trying to develop everything in one go, because as you might imagine, this is quite a big functionality, because we would need to put in the logic to create an evidence map, then because the language between teacher registration and nurse registration is completely different. So we would also need logic around how to change the language strings, ideally on the administrator interface, how to give different criteria in. Sometimes the partially meets, and no evidence categories would work, whereas in other cases you might have 4 levels. Then in some cases you might want to assign a certain assessor to a group of students, and other assessors wouldn't be able to see the evidence map. And then also having different views, because this evidence map is really nice when you look at one student, but we already know that sometimes assessors want to look at standard 1 across all students and standard 2 across all students. So kind of making that possible and making it flexible so that the visualization can have different views is also quite important. And so there are lots and lots of components included, of course. And if we put everything into one basket and said, okay, now we'll sit down, develop that, we'd probably not be done for a long time and nobody would be able to use it. Because it would also mean we'd have to imagine everything in the beginning, work everything out, and then at the end give the big functionality to everybody and only then get feedback. And that oftentimes is not really that great in software development, because as we know, we oftentimes change our ideas, learn within a quarter of a year, within half a year, teaching changes, teaching methods change, so the requirements change quite quickly sometimes. And therefore we are rather taking an approach which starts small, start with something that is feasible, that can stand alone, make that available to the community, and grow from there. So that we, with time, get to the intended and full functionality that we want to have. But with each step, actually get feedback from users, and not just wait until the very end, so that we can, for example, incorporate some of Heather's ideas or other ideas that might be floating around in the room, because I can already see some people thinking really, really hard how that might work for them. And so if you only are able to let us know at the end of the entire development, then putting your ideas in may not really be so easily possible, because we now have this big thing there, and checking some other things in can be tricky. Whereas if we know of all the ideas in the beginning, we can anticipate them, or we can already incorporate them. We may not be able to do everything, because of course that depends quite a bit on funding, but we already know what the system should do and can leave our doors open instead of closing them. And so what we have already done so far is three things. One thing, of course, the initial analysis together with the University of Canberra and Teacher Quality Institute, as well as University of Wollongong. We also had a session last year at Mahara where people came together, looked at the idea, discussed it, and then went away and wrote some user stories. So that we know, okay, we have students that have certain requirements, we have teachers, we also have assessors. Then we don't just have university instructors, but also teachers in a different part of their life, and all those things we have already collated. But of course it doesn't include everything, because it was from the organizations that we worked with. From that we've started a prototype. Meaning that we implemented the annotations and also started on making it possible so that an entire collection could be called SmartEvidence and can then later on be automatically transformed into a proper evidence collection. We started with the annotations because that was something achievable within a relatively short time frame. And while it is not tied yet to the visualization, it helps us later on to pull that part into the evidence map and make available. But of course now it is at the time that we want to do more work on it and want to incorporate more ideas and also see more what people in New Zealand, Australia, and around the world actually think about this feature, and whether it would be useful to implement into core Mahara, or whether it's something that actually not so many people need. And that's why we are talking more about the feature and kind of getting ideas from people of what they would like to see there, whether the idea itself is good but kind of completely flawed because evidence map in other areas look totally different, and all those things. So we already know that, of course, if, organizations and also accreditation agencies have different templates and also need to have different requirements. So instead of trying to make it just work for one organization, we need to be flexible. And there is already some work available on which we might be able to base our development work, because they have already looked at a lot of frameworks and seen how can we actually map them to something that is that can be processed by software, instead of always hard coding everything, but really make it so that a framework can be set up directly on the administrator interface, or that a framework can actually in the end maybe even be imported, so that it reads certain criteria from a table or from an HTML page or from an XML page. And those ideas are really, really great to have, and we very much welcome your feedback on them, so that we can continue with the work and continue conceptualizing it, changing it. And then, of course, if somebody has a lot of money, then we are not saying no to that one either, so that we can actually implement some of those things. Because Mahara is an open source product, and therefore there are no license fees that flow back to the project, but it also depends on the user community to actually contribute to it. So if you have any questions about it, please feel free to talk to me, and I can also get you in touch with Shane Nüssler from the University of Canberra or others if you're interested in kind of collaborating with them before you actually look at the software development side, and then see how we can all as a community make it happen. Now I think we still have a few minutes time for questions if you have any. Stephen.
So is the prototype going to be rolled out, Kristina, in 15.10 being released in October?
Annotations have already been included in Mahara since last version, so 15.04. The other things, not yet, because the pages that can have the category of SmartEvidence still need a little bit of reworking. But we successfully, from each version to each version in Mahara, we do want to include more of SmartEvidence directly into the core system. So if you're thinking of using it with the Faculty of Education, at least for the annotation part, instead of just using regular unstructured feedback, then you will have it available next year, because we are planning on updating myportfolio.school.nz over the summer holidays to 15.10. Mm-hmm. Anne.
Sounds fabulous. We're just in the process of looking at moving to 15.04. And as you know, we've been working at nursing portfolios, we've moved to midwifery, and now we're looking at maybe pharmacy.
Fantastic.
So these are all, competency-based type of things. So I could see a big, that would be really helpful for us to map it in that way.
Yeah.
I'll have to look at 15.04 and see what's in there.
Thank you for your feedback. And for Otago, that was Anne Stevens from Healthshare and Bay of Plenty DHB. And she has been using Portfolios for a number of years already, and uses it with nurses, but now also pharmacists, and can see the functionality work there really well. And in the initial stages, actually, and we also found an evidence map from pharmacists. I think it was in Australia. And instead of just having tick boxes in the one we saw from TQI, they only had colored in areas. So it was really just a table and then colorization, so that you saw how many bars somebody had. So nothing really sophisticated in order to actually see, well, does that mean fully met, or does somebody still have work to do? And of course, if you do it on paper, it can be quite tricky to kind of mark something initially and then either get rid of it or use whiteout to overwrite things, or just cross things out and then put your final tick mark on it.
So how does it handle where you have, I think you mentioned it earlier, but I wasn't quite sure how it would work, where you have one piece of evidence, but it meets, many standards.
Yeah. So the question is how it would be handled if it has one piece of evidence and needs to meet multiple standards. Let's go back to the full one. So that would be handled by you having the evidence sitting there, and then just writing annotations for each of the substandards. So what you would do is, if you say this evidence here, for example, also belongs to 1.5, you tick it, a pop-up window comes up in which you can type your annotation why you think for yourself that piece of evidence, or that collection of pieces of evidence, meets this substandard. And then it gets the circle. And then an assessor can come in and sees, oh, there's some evidence. they read the annotation, and then in the annotation field, they would be able to say, yep, partially meets or fully meets, and they can also leave feedback on it, and therefore react to the annotation. And so a discussion can also ensue from that, so that it's not just, yeah, I tick the box, but I don't know why my assessor said that it meets it only partially and not fully, because I actually think it meets the criteria completely. Yeah, so there's quite a bit of this meta information then in there as well, which helps ideally with the reflection process and also explaining things, why certain decisions were made. But Heath, you had a question first.
Just practicality of entering in the standards and criteria. Is that like import through a CSV, or do you have to enter it manually? Can you put in a whole program, or is it just a module?
Yeah.
How does that?
So the idea behind it is that initially it would be hard-coded, so that there would be a standard way of putting it into the code base, and then the evidence map would be produced. But in the future, our aim is that it can be set up by an institution admin or by a site admin on Mahara, and you just fill in fields, and then they generate the map, so that you can very easily, without any developer knowledge, decide on the language that you want to use, whether it's called standard or substandard or anything else, how many you have, how many pieces of evidence are needed by the students, whether the map sits at the front or back, and all those things. So that is to be configured.
So I guess for standards-based, the standards are out there already and you can put them in. But if you've got achievement-based, a lot of the time the outcomes and evidence are made up within in-house, and it's
that's the big challenge, because we don't want to produce an evidence map that only works for teachers in the ACT or for the registered teacher criteria in New Zealand, but we want to produce something that would work for pharmacists, for nurses, for architects, and potentially also for other things that are more fluid, that are not just standards based. And that's why we need to look at a number of those things, and that's what CETIS, the research group around Simon Grant in the UK, have already done. They looked at a lot of standards frameworks and mapped out where they differ, where they are common things, and then started developing a language around of how that can actually be reproduced on a code base, so that you don't always have to roll your own, but you can actually define things more easily and then use those more globally. So hopefully we can base some of our work on theirs, so as not having to reinvent the wheel.
With the upcoming enhancements to Moodle 3 with outcomes and competencies and that sort of stuff, do you see any overlapping between how it's going to manage and deal with competencies and where this might fit with that sort of thing?
No, we haven't looked at that, because what we want to avoid is that we are tied too closely to Moodle. Mahara is a standalone product, so it also needs to work with other learning management systems. But one way, of course, is also that at some point it would be good to look at how could we import content or outcomes that have already been met in Moodle directly into SmartEvidence, so that the data entry doesn't have to be done twice.
Those outcomes and competencies across into your portfolio, so that
Yeah.
as a student you've got a record of those that you can take elsewhere.
I mean, one possibility would, probably relatively simple one, would be to use the portfolio export and enhance that from Moodle to Mahara, so that you can't just export artifacts, say a paper that you've written or a forum post you've written, but also outcomes and associated artifacts, and then either just push them straight to Mahara and then put them into the evidence map, or whether there's directly a workflow that says, okay, you want to push it across. I see that you have a SmartEvidence map. Do you want to include it directly there? For which substandard should it go, and things like that. So that really depends on what the users want, on what the requirements are also from organizations, and how feasible it is and how quickly it can be developed. I think we are out of time now. If you have any other questions, please feel free to talk to me afterwards, and I'm handing over to Richard now. Thank you very much.